Hello and welcome back, and today we want to continue talking about 4-bay NAS systems. I want to talk about the brand new LockerStor 4 from Store, and I want to compare it against the latest 4-bay from QNAP, the TS-451D2. But before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room. These two are odd NASes for me to compare. The reason being that architecturally, and pretty much in terms of almost all of the hardware we're seeing here, this end of the table is hugely OP. It is incredibly overpowered compared to that one, and the price difference between them is actually noticeably large. However, a lot of the comparisons on this channel come from several sources. First and foremost, they come from the comments when people ask, oh, what's this NAS compared to this NAS? Like the other one is from NAS Compares in the comment section. But ultimately, it's when you guys have certain requirements from your network attached storage, and these two systems, although they arrive with great first-party application support that I will be talking about later on in the video, a number of you choose NAS solutions like these for their hardware and their third-party support, and the applications and the systems that are supported by third-party applications, third-party cloud applications, Office 365 and G Suite, as well as third-party tools in your office environment that just need the data, really. They don't care about what the first-party platform, Store or QNAP have at the back end. All they care about is the output in their third-party systems. So a lot of the time when they've got some money to spend, they'll generally have about $1,000 to throw around. A lot of businesses, home users less so, but generally they'll have somewhere between £500 to £1,000 to spend on the system and the hard drive media. And when you break it down to the amount of storage you need, and you look at 2 and 4 TB drives, what they're going for these days, 100 nicker a pop or something, and then they'll buy those drives, and then suddenly they realise that in order to stay within that budget and to still have that amount of storage and array configuration to support things, they have to scale back the hardware sometimes. Nevertheless, these two systems, once again for about $1,000, are very, very similar in terms of the price once you include the hard drives. On their own, they're actually quite, very different between them. With the LockerStor 4 from Store arriving at around £570 to £580, including VAT, but not including the hard drive media, and the 451D2 arriving at about 430 quid, give or take, maybe 430 if you shop around. And again, that includes tax, but not the hard drive media. So straight away, there's about 150, 140 quid price difference between them. You could add a couple of terabytes to all your storage on each drive for that sort of money. So a lot of you might already be moving to this side of the table. But in terms of raw hardware you're getting inside, there is a huge disparity between these two that's definitely worth touching on, and will make you wonder about that extra money, whether it's worth spending that money on bigger hard drives or spending it on your internal hardware. But before going any further, let's talk about what these two NASes have in common. Ultimately, what it means if you buy either one of these two devices, what you're going to get. As touched on, you are getting a hardware and software combined system. They both arrive with their own NAS operating system. It's more of a user interface and software platform, but in the case of Store, it is ADM, and in the case of QNAP, it is QTS or QUTS, depending on where you are in the world, and I know they're changing the name of it. Now, with that, you've got photo management tools, music management tools, video management tools. You have got multi-tiered backup tools, allowing you to back up NAS to USB, NAS to NAS, NAS to cloud, and other platforms too. They arrive with support of 4K and 1080p multimedia, both transcoding and playback, as well as within their own first-party software and in third-party software too, such as Plex Media Server. They both arrive with background snapshot support. They both arrive with RAID support, RAID 0, RAID 5, RAID 6, RAID 10, and more, as well as JBOD and the boring ones too. They both have USB expansions, although arguably more expansions on the QNAP. They both arrive with support of containers and virtual machines, with first-party tools from QNAP in the form of Container Station, Linux Station, and virtualization station. And on the Store, they've got VirtualBox. They've got Portainer, and they have Ubuntu or Linux kind of platform app there as well. Now, you may already have noticed there that I've mentioned third-party apps on the Store, and that's because Store has I would argue, more third-party app support than it has first-party app support, and QNAP hits more of a 50-50 balance overall in terms of first and third party. Also, QNAP has, I would argue, more evolved applications. They've spent a lot more money on their software, and that is kind of systematic. When you look at the money you're paying for this, you're paying that a larger chunk of that money is going towards the software than the hardware. And if that's something you're not interested in, that could largely affect which one of these two NASs you choose. But the photo software on the QNAP has AI recognition. There are more multimedia applications in the first party, such as Multimedia Console as well on the QNAP. But the Asus Store counters this by including a lot more third-party apps and third-party programs on their own app center. They've both got a very similar number of applications for client devices, iOS devices and Android, as well as desktop PCs with Windows and OS X and Android as well. So there's a large degree of support there with those client apps to migrate and communicate data between them. Again, slightly better quality apps, I have to say, on the QNAP. They've got more money to throw at that. They are generally a bigger brand, whether it's QNAP on their own or QNAP and IEI. And ultimately, between them, you are getting a very solid NAS. You're getting a NAS that's Intel powered. You're getting a NAS that's DDR4 memory supported. You're getting a NAS at 2.5 GBE. You're getting a NAS with 3 years warranty. And you're getting a 4-bay, very robust solution for home and business solutions. So whether it is that you're buying this for the home to enjoy multimedia on your console, your family, or backing up devices, or you're utilizing it for cameras and VMs and multi-tiered backup solutions and editing and stuff like that, they're both great solutions for that. So whichever one of these you buy, you've got a nice solution, okay? But let's talk about what's different, because let's face it, you didn't come to this video to watch me tell you what's the same. That's ludicrous. You ever heard of a comparison, for the Lord's sake? So, first, let's talk about the CPU inside both of these devices. Big disparity here between them, although it's the same CPU family, the Intel Celeron J4000 series. The CPU inside the 451D2 is a dual-core, the J4025, a 2.0 GHz processor that can be burst up to 2.9 GHz. That CPU has got a UHD 600 embedded graphics for 4K and 1080p, so that means an embedded graphic portion of that CPU dedicated to handling graphical data manipulation. Again, transcoding, virtual machines, anything that's graphical with data, it has a portion of CPU that can do that stuff. On top of that, that CPU supports DDR4 memory with 2 GB arriving in this system by default that can be upgraded to 8 GB maximum across 2 SODIMM slots, 2400 MHz memory. That CPU inside there is rated at 1946 currently at the time of recording on CPU Benchmark. It's a great processor, we've talked about it before, and although it does support virtualization and it does support a number of like that Linux VM tool as well and containers, it should be argued that a dual-core CPU is not great long-term for that, because you have to make sure you provision some of the system hardware to run the hardware, which means you're effectively going to cut down the middle, your 2 GB and your 2 cores, to 1 core and 1 GB for a VM, which isn't a lot. Now, the LockerStor 4 arrives, once again, that same series CPU, but a different one. It is a 4-core, quad-core J4125. It's a 2.0 GHz processor that can be burst up to 2.7 GHz. Same embedded graphics component there across both of the CPUs, but it arrives with 4 GB of DDR4 by default that can be upgraded to 8. So double the memory, double the CPU there, and it rates over 3,300 on CPU Benchmark at time of recording. An enormous jump there between the two of them, 75% or so higher. It is a noticeably better processor overall, and that 4 GB by default is lovely. There is a huge price difference between these two devices, but just bear in mind that the hardware you're getting inside this, it's about value, not cost. There are other reasons why these two differ in the hardware stakes. I mean, again, as mentioned, they are 4-bay devices there, but you do have an LCD panel here for real-time control on the LockerStor. It should be added that you can set this device up to the point of storage readiness without a graphical user interface. You can put drives inside this device, and you can actually action the initialization and setup just using the LCD panel. I'm hoping to do a dedicated video on that. Whereas the majority of them either require a mobile or a desktop system, this can be done with a mobile or desktop system, but it can also be done with no system at all. You can just plop it down, pop in the drives, and you can negotiate the majority of the customization and initialization just using the LCD panel and the default login information. And then after it's set up and the RAID is synchronized, you can do the rest with the phone if you choose. Now, they've both got USB copy buttons there on the front and USB 3 ports on the front, which is always good to hear, but it's worth highlighting in terms of design, things are very, very different here. The QNAP arrives with that plastic chassis there. It's a charcoal two-tone black there, with each tray being lockable there. Each tray, if we remove one, it's a plastic tray. Oh, that's probably really loud on the mic. I'm going to remove that in the edit. Sorry, had to cut there. That noise that made hitting the table was unbearably loud. Sorry, had to cut there. The noise of that hitting the table was unbearably loud. The trays themselves are plastic in design, and they'll click and load. So you pop a hard drive inside, you can remove the sides and it will clip the drive in place, but it is still a plastic tray, which I know some of you aren't overly keen on. There are screw holes for 2.5-inch media as well. And again, not spring loaded, but it is lockable there, but that's not really a hard lock. It's more designed to stop people accidentally removing a drive whilst the system's in utilization and destabilizing your RAID. And as mentioned, plastic tray, bit of ventilation there on the side and on the base and via the front, with a fan on the rear. Now, in the case of the LockerStor is far more industrial in its design. It's a metal chassis all the way around. Where's the QNAP? On the side there, we've got a ventilation panel on the side, just like the QNAP. And the front of it with the LCD panel there as well. We've got each of those bays. The bays have got a lovely bit of ventilation there. Each bay is lockable, and it's worth highlighting the trays are metal in design. They are screwed, so you will have to screw those drives in one by one, 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch. But it has to be said, a number of users certainly prefer metal chassis. There are arguments for and against. The arguments for: excellent heat dissipation with metal there, always working very, very well with the internal cooling. On top of that, the idea that it feels more robust and rugged, and it can not so much take a knock, but it seems a lot higher build quality when things are metal for a number of users, and they quite like that rather than the plastic stuff which is susceptible to heat. That said, because it's metal, if you use more robust drives, larger capacity, larger than about 8 TB, they do generally make a bit more noise in the clicks, hums and whirs whilst in operation, and a metal chassis will amplify that just the tiniest bit. And if you're in close proximity with a NAS system, you will certainly notice that. So there are arguments for and against. I won't make a judgment based on plastic versus metal, but I will say in terms of design, I quite prefer the LockerStor design, actual look of it. I know some of you aren't as in love with it as I am. It looks quite aggressive, but I quite like the robustness of it. Not including the material, because I know that's divisive, but I will argue I quite like the chassis frame on this. And it's got lots of LEDs there on the front, giving real-time information, and of course they're LCD. Now, if we turn them around, we can have a look at the ports and connections to see another big area of difference between them. Now, both of them arrive with USB 3 support, and again that supports external storage devices, their own range of expansions, and lots of third-party peripherals and devices and KVM setups, keyboard, video, mouse can be connected to these. They both arrive with HDMI 2.0, so it's 4K at 60 frames per second output on both of these devices, which can be utilised by a myriad of first-party and third-party platforms, and both of them arrive with a parallel running HDMI platform so that you can have multiple users and multiple apps dealing with the NAS, and at the same time have a completely parallel, independent, but still synchronized HDMI output for multimedia, for business, for surveillance, and more. But one big area of difference between them are those network ports. Now, both of these devices arrive with different network protocol in terms of overall bandwidth. The 451D2 arrives with 2 times 1 GBE. That means each one of those ports at 1 gigabit Ethernet will give you around 100 to 110 megabytes per second, which can be link aggregated to around 200 to 220 megabytes per second, which is great to hear. But given a number of new QNAP solutions have got 2.5 GBE, it's a bit underwhelming to see 1 GBE suddenly rear its ugly head on an Intel-powered NAS. We're seeing some of their Annapurna and Marvell ARM60 and 32-bit systems arriving with 2.5 GBE now. It seems a little bit intentional to give this at 1 gig within the family portfolio. It's still a very, very solid solution, and not a lot of users have made the jump to plus gigabit systems yet. So this is more of an argument for the future. But 1 GBE, I'm just very surprised that QNAP went for that on this system. Now, in the case of the LockerStor, the LockerStor 4, they have arrived with 2.5 GBE by default. Now, LockerStor were the first brand to bring 2.5 GBE to market. They brought 2.5 in the Nimbus Store series to a desktop platform before anyone else did. 2.5 GBE had existed in some low-level switches, in even some very, very quick-to-market routers in some regions of the world. But LockerStor brought 2.5 GBE to the desktop NAS scene first, and they've embraced it very, very well, bringing solutions that are comparable in price to 1 GBE solutions of the same architecture, but all of them with that 2.5 GBE. So 2.5 GBE on each port means up to 250 megabytes per second per port, or that can be combined with link aggregation to 500 megabytes or so. So again, great future proofing there. And although it can be said that, you know, the QNAP can have larger Ethernet ports, you can add the USB 3 to 5 GBE adapter. That knocks around, I think, for about 60 to 80 quid. And this allows you to add a 5 GBE port, bang, onto your QNAP NAS here, and therefore interacting with it with a faster speed. You can get two of them, connect one to your PC if you like. It's not fair to highlight that, because LockerStor also have their own range of USB to network adapters. They've both got that option in their lifetime. So if you want to include that as a feature later on, they both have that. It's just arguable that the LockerStor has 2.5 GBE by default. Another area where the LockerStor has that improved performance is internally. The device has two NVMe SSD caching bays inside, which, although can't be used for raw storage, do allow a user to improve the internal performance of small file access, of more frequently accessed files even, and shared drive access from multiple users, where it will see and learn the files that are being accessed the most and make copies of them onto the cached area of storage, leveraging the higher performance, higher IOPS and lower latency of NVMe SSDs, and providing a lot of those benefits to the lower priced, larger but arguably slower hard drive RAID array on the front. Also, it's worth highlighting that the QNAP arrived with support of ext4 file system internally, whereas the LockerStor 4 has ext4 and BTRFS. And BTRFS on this device will allow you to have lower resource consuming background snapshots. It will allow faster shared folder recreation and file self-healing, with checksums being created at the beginning and end of transmissions compared, and corrupted files being repaired with the the blueprint of the healthy file. So LockerStor have brought a lot to market here with that system. But it goes back to my earlier point. You've got to highlight that LockerStor handles third-party handling very, very well indeed, but I think it struggles the tiniest bit when it comes to the first-party comparison. QNAP basically win the day when it comes to their software, both in terms of their GUI, in terms of their applications, and the depth of those applications as well, the amount of things they can do with AI processing and support. Even camera licenses, with 8 camera licenses included inside this, whereas the LockerStor 4 still has great base level software. It's just not quite as evolved yet as that of the QNAP. Ultimately, it comes down to your own priorities between these two brands. I think that what they do very, very well, and the price difference between them is fair. I think both of them are priced quite fairly for what you're getting for your money, but then it comes down to what you actually need from your system. And again, first party, third party. I can't really argue with either one of them. Their support of both first and third party. They've both done a very good job, but there's no avoiding the fact that some of them are better at other things than others. Do let me know which one of these two NASs are the ones that you think you might go for. Do click like if you've enjoyed the video and click subscribe to learn more. I am looking forward to finding out which one of these two do you think is the better system. Maybe you have purchased them, why not let other people know what you think. And do check out my overviews of both QNAP and LockerStor's ADM and QTS platforms respectively before making your purchase. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Visit the links in the description to NASComparisonspan.com, and otherwise I will see you next time.